From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
This special lecture is co-sponsored by the John W. Kluge Center, the Prints and Photographs Division, and the Conservation Division here at the Library of Congress. Our special thanks to Prints and Photographs and Conservation for collaborating with us on this event. The impetus for that collaboration is that our presenter, Adrienne Lundgren, is a senior photograph conservator in the library's Conservation Division. She has been working with the photographs of American artist and photographer F. Holland, of whose work the library holds the largest collection in the world. And she is now concluding her tenure as this year's Kluge Staff Fellow here at the John W. Kluge Center. It's a heartwarming illustration of how library divisions work collaboratively to produce something extraordinary. And Adrienne's work is truly extraordinary. I do not have the expertise to fully understand it or appreciate its complexity. But from what I have seen in the past year, Adrienne has made a significant breakthrough in how we understand, date, and attribute the work of an artist. By analyzing the physical attributes of Day's photographs, she has uncovered new findings pertaining to Day's methods. Her findings have implications for how we distinguish original works by artists from copy prints, reproductions, or even forgeries. She even assembled a special machine to analyze paper textures based on a machine built by conservator Paul Messier. And anyone who can assemble her own machine immediately wins my admiration. Her scholarship is truly making an impact on our understanding of photography. Adrienne is the latest example of the work of Kluge Staff Fellows in changing our understanding of the world around us. The library's staff is full of brilliant, inquisitive minds passionate about their areas of expertise. The Kluge Staff Fellowship allows one such staff member each year to conduct independent research using the library's collections in pursuit of their scholarship. Funded from the gift left by the late John W. Kluge to the Kluge Center, the Staff Fellow is one of more than 100 scholars who pass through our walls every year, creating a vibrant Scholars Center here on Capitol Hill, bringing scholars and researchers together from around the world. For more information about the Kluge Center and the work of our scholars, sign up for our RSS feed using the sign-up sheet in the back, or visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, K-L-U-G-E. I'd like to now introduce Andrew Robb. Andrew is the head of the Special Format Conservation section within the Conservation Division, and he leads a team that Adrienne works on. He will give Adrienne the proper introduction that she deserves. And a note about the order of today's program. Andrew will introduce Adrienne. Adrienne will speak about her work, and then we'll have approximately 10 minutes for a question and answer period. Following the question and answer, the staff from Prints and Photographs has been gracious enough to exhibit original F. Holland Day images from the library's collections in the next room. We'll also have a reception simultaneous to the display. However, please note that there is no food or drink allowed near the photographs. So you'll have to choose your order. Wine and then art, or art then wine. So without further ado, please welcome Andrew Robb.
Thank you, Jason. It's a real pleasure to introduce Adrienne to you. Her training includes a master's degree in the conservation of art with a major in the conservation of photographs from the Winterthur Museum, University of Delaware program, as well as fellowships at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the International Museum of Photography at the George Eastman House. Since 2002, we've been fortunate to have her here on staff at the Conservation Division at the Library of Congress. And with her arrival, I had some help with taking care of these 12 million photographs, so I was very grateful for that. And shortly thereafter, Dana Hemingway came on board, so we have 3 conservators. So now we're down to a ratio of 4 million photographs to, or 4 million photographs to 1 conservator. And this is a practical challenge that is not unusual for a photograph conservator. There are not very many of us, and generally at international meetings, we're in an audience of about this size. These are some of the photographs of that 12 million. So we have a very diverse collection here. And her fellowship has allowed her to really focus on the important task of compiling basic comprehensive information, the kind of information that Jason summarized very well, how it's useful, why it's useful for conservators, why it's useful for other historians and people interested in photography. It represents a significant step forward in understanding his working methods and the materials he used. This information will be invaluable to us and other conservators in the future, as well as for those understanding the photographs from the era of the late 19th century, an era that really marks the emergence of photography into what we recognize it today, ranging from art to snapshots. But the question for us as often as conservators is we may be faced with this kind of situation. These are 2 photographs from Day. We have one on the left. It seems to be in poor condition. It seems to be discolored. It seems to be faded. And yet we have one on the right that's in extremely good condition. Why is this? We honestly don't really know. And that's why we need the kind of information that Adrienne is compiling so that we can make better decisions about how we treat these photographs and how we care for them. In 1963, George Stout, one of the founders of the field of conservation, stated, "Conservators must acknowledge that much of what counts as learning, much of the mind's valued property in this area has never been tagged with adequate labels or put into compartments. It seems to be our plain chief duty to do this. We ought, in my view, to keep our minds on this and by all means in our reach to bind the jumbled pieces together into a clean, clear region of knowledge." Stout set a demanding example for us. Excuse me, I went a little bit too fast. Gave away the punchline, sorry about that. He said he was a demanding scholar, focusing on the work of paintings and works like the encyclopedia of, short encyclopedia of painting materials, which if you're in conservation school, you get this book. Gettins and Stout is this iconic book that every conservation student gets. But he was also a practical man. He really was a conservator. And one of the most interesting things to read is Monuments Men. Dana told me about this book, so I was grateful to get it. And it really tells the story of a practical conservator, someone who returned the Ghent altarpiece to its pre-World War II home. And if you don't know who George Stout is, you probably will by December because George Clooney is playing him in a movie about the Monuments Men, and you'll get to see the whole thing in living color. It's also an amusing parlor game for conservators because we get to decide who would play us if we were ever in a movie. But in summary, I think George Stout would be really pleased both by the work as well as the opportunity that's been offered to her as a Kluge Fellow. Certainly we are here. As Stout put it, through her research, we'll be able to increase the clarity and reduce the jumble of how we consider the work of Day at this pivotal moment in the history of photography. With that said, I'll leave it to Adrienne.
Wow, I'm trying to live up to George Stout. I think Meryl Streep should play me. All right. I've always been a fan. Let's see. First slide, someone? There. So it's such a pleasure for me to talk here today about the work of F. Holland Day. I'm obsessed with him. And I'm here to talk about Day, but like Andrew said, more importantly, I'm here to talk about photographs and how do we look at them. And I want to share with you their complexities and how I think we can start to understand them better. For me, photographs are just magical objects, and anyone who has seen a photograph come out of a seemingly blank piece of paper can't be unmoved by the wonder of it. It's an amazing thing to see. And that's why I became a photograph conservator. I really wanted to understand these things on a fundamental level. And most things, when you understand them, they just lose their beauty, but photography never lost that for me, and I think it's because it's so complicated. And there are so many ways to make a photograph. It can be made with different binders, different light-sensitive systems, or have various finishing techniques like coatings. And so when we start to investigate them, we really realize how complicated that they are. So photography started in 1839, and it's not that long ago, really, but yet we know so little about it. And so for me, this project was a discovery about learning about one artist, F. Holland, but also learning about platinum printing, which is one of his main printing techniques. But more than that, it's about systematic looking and how do we observe and document photographs, define and catalog them and their attributes, and how do we know a print and how do we know the artist. So looking at materials is like being in a time machine. It's going back to the moment of an object's creation and seeing the thought process of the artist as they're making the print. And I think of it as like the ultimate and primary resource material. So knowing the artist's choices means knowing what they used and when they used it, but it also means knowing what they didn't use. And so here you see F. Holland in his darkroom, and on the other side are tubes of platinum papers as they come from the manufacturer. And so what I want to know is what is he buying and what's on his shelf, and then what's he doing in the darkroom to alter what he's buying to make the beautiful prints that we see today. And the idea is that through systematic cataloging of materials, we can start to unravel this. And then by doing this, we can also start to make conclusions about the dating and attribution of works of art. So like Andrew said, this isn't groundbreaking stuff. In paintings, they do it all the time. They look at X-rays to see underdrawings or analyze pigments to date them. But with photography, it's just not as clear. And some would say, why does it really matter? Can't you just reprint the negative? Isn't it about the image? And if the negative is by the artist, does the print and who made it really matter? But photographs are not just images, no more than a painting is an image. And the print is the final expression of the artist's vision, not the negative. So not only is the aesthetic of the print determined by the photographic technology available at the time, but the artist's decisions in the printing of the negative make the print unique. And so for those who study photography and who know all of this already, we know that much of what is written is based on the scholarship of the image. And we know that images can be very unreliable when making statements about the attribution and dating of a piece. So we know that prints can be made from original negatives much later, or you can make copy negatives from other prints. So when we look at a photograph, how can we determine when a print is made and who printed it? And how can we write an accurate history of photography if we can't determine these things? So here's an example of my point. This is Lewis Hines' Powerhouse Mechanic. It was just made into a US postage stamp, so you'll be seeing a lot of it. And these prints look different, but does it matter? It's the same image, so does it matter that they look different? But through materials analysis, conservators have determined that the warm-toned print that you see is the only print that was made by Hines at the time that the negative was taken. It's the only one known to exist. And that the print on the other side, the very neutral-toned print, is one that was made in 1990, and it was sold as a forgery. It was trying to pass as a vintage Lewis Hines, and it wasn't. So do you see them differently now? And you can see that the tonality of the images is very different, but the cropping of the image is also very different. And so when we look at Hines, don't we want to talk about his work referring to the print that he made, not the print that was made to fool? So how can we determine when and why, or when and by who a print is made? And how do we discuss a photographic artist's working methods and understand their vision? And we have to look at the materials. They're tethered in time to the moment of when the print is made. And so here you see a photograph from the Day collection. So you can look at it just based on the image, but you can also look at it in its full kind of assembly with the original mount. And then also in raking light, which is the last photograph, you can see that it has, you can see the texture of the mount and the texture of the photographic paper. And so I would say that you need to document all of these attributes to really understand Day and what he's trying to show us. So the first slide talked about catalog raisonne. So what is a catalog raisonne? And you can see that on the slide here. And you can say, well, is this so hard to do? But in fact, it's incredibly difficult. The Catalog Raisonne Scholars Forum describes the main challenges in the production of catalog raisonnes as, quote, establishing authenticity and its complexities, establishing reliable factual information, and adapting traditional cataloging methods to new art media such as photography. Photography being specifically identified as challenging, as attributions and acquiring factual information are especially difficult in this medium. So this project was essentially to approach establishing factual information about photography from a big data standpoint, or as much as you can get from looking at one artist's work. I wanted to examine the materials, establish reliable and consistent data collection methods, and then turn those attributes into data points that could be analyzed in various ways. And so to do this, I'd have to find a collection that spanned a whole career of an artist. It had a large number of items in it, and it had to have impeccable provenance. And lucky for me, the library is awesome, and we had the perfect collection. So the library has the largest, like Jason said, the largest collection of F. Holland Day photographs in the world. The collection's formally titled the Louise Imogene Guiney Collection because Day was friends with the poet and he named it after her. So it spans his entire career from 1883 to 1925, and it came directly from the Day estate to the library following his death. He also gave us his published books, letters to and from Mrs. Guiney, the poet, and more recently, his other personal correspondence in the manuscripts division donated by the Norwood Historical Society. So we are just full of Day over here. So who is Fred Holland Day? So F. Holland Day, as he was professionally known, was born in South Dedham, Massachusetts in 1864, and he was the only son of a progressive and religious family of Unitarian Universalists who believed that all men were created equal and that charity was an obligation of the fortunate. He was an only child, and his father owned a leather business and became one of the wealthiest men in their town. He encouraged his son to read, to appreciate history, and to love art. And Fred undertook many projects as a young adult along these lines, researching local history and genealogy, and art projects such as this portfolio that's now in the manuscripts division that he made when he was 17. In 1893, at 29, Day went into business of his own and founded a fine art book publishing firm with his partner Herbert Copeland. Known for their high-quality publications, Copeland and Day were heavily influenced by the arts and crafts movement. The firm focused on decorative bindings and avant-garde illustrations, covering a wide variety of subjects from children's books to poetry, with special attention to materials and design. And Day becomes interested in photography in 1886 when he borrows a camera from a friend on vacation. And he writes to another friend, "How have I spent my summer? Well, you must know that I was very much infatuated last season. And this summer I have been married. Now don't open your eyes only to my camera, and I have become a full-fledged amateur in the art of photography, and a delicious time I have had of it too." By the mid-1890s, he moves from an amateur to a full-fledged artist, and in 1899, Copeland and Day dissolved their publishing firm. Day takes his talent for layout and design, as well as his appreciation for paper texture and surface, and now applies it to his new love, photography. So Day shows his first photographs publicly in 1895 at the Photographic Salon in London. The show was sponsored by the Linked Ring, a British-based art photography group with international membership. And following the show, the Linked Ring invited Day to join in response to this print that you see here entitled Hannah. A review of Hannah describes it as a masterpiece of its kind. His second show was here in DC, and it was in 1896, and it led to the purchase of 3 of his prints by the Smithsonian as part of a mission to collect American art photography. And so Day begins to receive notice from those well-established in the photography world, including Alfred Stieglitz, a fellow Linked Ring member. A review of Day's work in Camera Notes states, "Day represents the idealistic element of which he is emphatically the leader, and the photographic world may expect great things of him. Day begins to focus on depicting themes from history and literature, and through the exploration of these themes, he becomes increasingly convinced that photography is an art, and as such, all subjects open to the painter and sculptor should be available for representation and interpretation by the photographer. And in commitment to this belief, he undertakes his most controversial series on the Passion and Crucifixion of Christ. So from 1896 to 1898, Day devotes himself to the depiction of sacred subjects. And in 1898, he, having prepared for the role by losing weight and starving himself and growing his hair, he sets out to photograph the crucifixion with himself as Christ. Very ambitious. To create a more authentic appearance, he goes to great lengths to obtain the perfect props, including 3 crosses with large wooden nails, period costumes, and a crown of thorns. And there's this great letter in the manuscripts division from his father, Louis, who's on a business trip to Florida, and he says, "You gotta love supportive parents." I'm very impressed by this letter. He's like, "I will see what I can do about some thorns. I hardly think I can get exactly what you desire, as they grow on the orange trees, and it's very difficult to find new growth long enough to make a wreath. Perhaps you could wire the thorns onto something that would answer your purpose. I can send any quantity of them you want, or I'll do the best that I can with sprouts, although the thorns are not very close together on them." It's like, you're gonna do a crucifixion in our yard and you want thorns? I'll get those for you. It's just so awesome. Having obtained all of his props, Day sets to photographing over 250 negatives of himself and friends depicting the experience of Christ during the crucifixion and his subsequent resurrection. It's just what you do with friends, you know. Day was very specific in his vision for this series as he undertook this project with the utmost seriousness and dedication. And these photographs are not meant to be the documentation of a reenactment, but more an artistic expression of the experience of Christ. And they're meant to cause an emotional response in the viewer. The most well-known piece of the series is composed of 7 close-up portraits of Day depicting the final thoughts of Christ on the cross. This group of negatives, entitled The 7 Words, were sometimes displayed individually, but were often displayed in a single frame. Starting with "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do," to "It is finished." Following the exhibition of these sacred pictures, Day writes an article entitled "Sacred Art and the Camera." And he says, "There will always be narrow minds to question the rights of portraying sacred subjects in any medium, and to them the less said the better. But to them that criticize only the photographer's right, I can but advise patience. Give us some time to get out the drill work, and then speak your harshest." As was expected by Day's friends, these photographs caused a major stir in photography and beyond. But regardless of the criticism, Day continued to show these pictures over the next 10 years. So now a well-known figure in photography, Day becomes a leader. And we can see from his correspondence that he's a source of encouragement and knowledge for other photographers, and especially women photographers. In his capacity as a leader and mentor, he attempts to form an American organization dedicated to art photography based in Boston, much to the ire of Mr. Stieglitz and his associates, who considered Stieglitz the leader of art photography in the US, and New York, of course, as the center, not Boston. Frustrated, Day changes his focus to creating an exhibition out of the metropolitan squabbles of the United States by bringing American art photography to Europe. And this again upsets Stieglitz, and he attempts to outmaneuver Day and put an end to the show, but Day succeeds in spite of his efforts. And opening in 1900 and entitled The New American School, this show featured many artists that were relatively unknown before, including the work of Edward Steichen, Alvin Langdon Coburn. A review of the show states, "Anyone who handles a camera is doing himself a disservice who misses this show. He shows some 100 pieces, and there is not a mediocre thing in the whole collection." In 1904, in November, Day receives terrible news. A fire destroys the building where he and 30 other artists had their studios, and the building was a total loss. Here he is looking through the rubble of all of his prints. "I'm sorry," or his fellow photographer and Mary Devens writes following the event, I am so sorry, for I know how great a loss yours is, for one's work can never be replaced, and you must have lost all of your splendid collection of negatives and prints, which I feel sure were there. And she was right. In fact, all that remained of Day's photographic work were the small number of prints given or sold to others and the prints that he had in his home. Following the fire, Day recedes from the public face of photography, still exhibiting work, but leaving the political and more public face to Alfred Stieglitz. And he seemed to have really wanted it, so good for him. Many people have the impression that Day stops photographing at this point, and in fact, that's not true. It's an incredibly productive period. However, we can see a change in focus, and he moves to focusing on things that are more close to his heart, like children in a camera club in Hampton, Virginia, or friends and family on vacation in Maine. And then he also does several allegorical series, such as The Prodigal Son, Saint Sebastian, and Orpheus. He continues photographing until 1916, when his attentions are drawn back to Norwood to care for his mother. And by 1925, Day's mother and his 3 closest friends have all passed away, and he has become virtually housebound. He dies in 1933 of prostate cancer, and in 1934, his collection comes to the library as an anonymous donation. So the Day collection at the library is massive, and in the first stages of this project, I had to figure out how I was going to get a handle on documenting systematically a collection of 690 photographic prints. And for the first step, I felt it was really necessary to create accurate photographic reproductions of each image in the collection. Not only is this a part of a catalog raisonne, but these photographs were also valuable in examining paper texture and making judgments about color and for reference in analytical work. So before this project, only 5% of the collection was digitized, and now the whole collection has been photographed using high-resolution digital photography. So they were shot, color balanced, and now the images can be compared accurately one to another throughout the collection. So here's 2 screenshots of some of the images, and if you imagine 7 screenshots, that's the entire collection. So it's almost 1,400 photographs. And here you see an example of the photographic documentation taken of each print. On the left is the print in normal light, and on the right is the print in raking light. And raking light means that it's lit from one direction at a very acute angle. And so you can see in the raking light photograph, you get a much better sense of the paper texture of the photographic print and also of the mounts. And here's just 2 details from the raking light shot, so you can see that they're really large images. In addition to the photo documentation, I also had to devise a method for tracking all of the items in the collection, as well as decide what attributes I felt were most important to record. So to track each item, a database was constructed using Microsoft Access, and this was chosen largely in part to its use throughout the library. All of the photographic documentation was linked into this database where each object had a record, and in the following slides you will see the other information gathered in the various sections. The first part of the database focused on what I call the curatorial metadata, and these are all pretty self-explanatory, and most of the information in this section was provided by Verna Curtis, the curator of photographs in the Prints and Photographs division. When deciding the other fields in the database, I had to think about the attributes that I find most important when examining and differentiating photographic prints one from another. We already looked at the photographic documentation, but I wanted to also record Day's markings and signatures, his photographic processes, his mounting papers and methods, and the types of photographic papers he used, including the color of the image material and the paper base. I felt that these attributes would provide a complete look at his work. These 3 images represent the signature, inscriptions, and retouching fields. Signatures were of 5 variations throughout the collection, and here's the earliest. It's the image the furthest away, I guess you would say. It's a blind stamp monograph containing the overlapping forms of his initials, FHD. Many prints had inscriptions either on the print or the mounts. This one shown here identifies this print and others of this sitter as part of the Orpheus series, previously unknown prior to this project. And here is an example of Day's amazingly precise retouching found on many of his prints. And it's just the really fine lines of watercolor that you see in the face. He should have been a conservator. He was really good. Here are 3 mounted prints in the collection. Prints were mounted either overall onto various types of colored paper cards, that's the center, or tipped onto layered paper mounts in literally 100 variations or so, or tipped onto French ruled mounts. These mount papers were described and researched to develop standard terminology and to document what style and what colors were used at which period and with which series. And this ended up being very helpful in determining when a print was mounted, if the mounting was done at the time the image was made or later, and it was also crucial in helping to attribute unattributed works to Day, as well as giving clues about works in the collection that were attributed to Day but actually weren't by him. Processes were visually identified at first. At the end of the project, similar prints were grouped together and representative samples were confirmed using analytical means. But for now, it's important to note that there are 5 main photographic processes found in the collection, cyanotypes being the blue one, silver gelatin printed out prints, which is the more warm brown orange one, salted paper, which is the one of the guy in the throne, platinum is the one in the center, and then silver gelatin developed out prints, which is the landscape. It's important to document the exact process used, as the appearance of the final image is greatly affected by the process it's printed in. And also because artists tend to use specific processes or variations on a process during certain points in their career, and it's a necessary component to understanding their aesthetic choices. So here's an example of how much a process can change the appearance of an image. Here are 2 Day prints of the same negative. This one is in platinum, so the brighter one is in platinum, and the other one is on a silver gelatin developed out paper. Out of the cataloging of the most obvious physical attributes of the prints, we can query the database and see some interesting things. First, looking at the database, we can run analyses like this one on print production, and we can see that Day's print production varies greatly based on the year. For the years 1899 to 1904, there is virtually no dated work in the collection, even though we know based on a historical record that he's working at this time. It's likely that most of the work was in the studio, and then it was burnt in the fire. So this graph really represents the art historical record that we see that goes with his life. So the studio fire happens and it burns a lot of the more recent work. And he acquired the studio in 1902. The collection seems to contain less work before 1904 than after 1904. And again, this is probably associated with the loss of earlier work in the studio fire. And in 1908, we see a great drop in his work, and that's the year that his father dies. So I'm sure he was taking care of things at home. And in 1914, we see him start to care for his mother, and he moves back home, and it kind of marks the end of his photographic career. When we gather the information from the process and signature fields in the database and we map them in a timeline, we get a visual representation of these 2 aspects of his career. Processes shown on the top and his signatures are shown on the bottom. The gray area in the middle represents the area with very little dated production in the collection, so conclusions about this period should be viewed as tenuous. But you can see that platinum was used from 1895 to around 1914. And in the future, I'd like to pursue this particular timeline by conducting more in-depth analysis on the platinum prints in the collection. Elemental analysis on the platinum prints thus far showed several processing additions and notable trace elements in the papers, such as lead, mercury, cobalt, and barium sulfate. If the introduction of these elements can be mapped on this timeline, it will become more refined, allowing for more distinctions in dating his platinum papers. But the type of information that we can currently gather from this timeline is still significant, and for instance, we can start to put dates around certain attributes. For instance, a blind stamped salted paper print puts it in the window of 1892 to 1898. Or that a silver gelatin printed out print can only be blind stamped, while silver gelatin developed out prints can have 5 possible signature methods. Or we could also see that a silver gelatin developed out print with black watercolor has to fall between the years of 1899 and 1907, while one with red pencil is likely from 1925 or later. So it's going to help us with the collection to date things that we don't know the dates of. When I collected the data on mounting papers, I wasn't sure if what it would reveal beyond this mount is on this print. But when you start to track the introduction of papers in the mounts, you can start to date mounts to a certain period. For instance, through this data, it became clear that although the crucifixion prints that you saw earlier were printed in 1898, they were likely mounted after 1906, when the appearance of the paper that is called gray with black fibers becomes visible in other work. This is further supported by the fact that some of the prints in the collection were damaged from the fire and the mounts weren't, so you could clearly see that the mounts had been added later. You can see that assembling these timelines together can help us break up the information and further narrow the date windows. For instance, print 35 is a platinum print with a blind stamp signature on a block card mount. The materials evidence would indicate that this print was made between the years of 1895 and 1898. Art historical evidence places the negative date at 1896, so now we can say that we know that this print was made within 2 years of the date of the negative. So beyond the information gathered visually, analytical tools were utilized to record various attributes of the papers of the photographic papers that couldn't be seen purely with the eye. And this was crucial if we wanted to determine what papers Day was using for his work. So which of these tins is he buying to make his prints, and then what is he doing in the darkroom in the processing of it to change it in any way? And lacking art historical records, the only way we can determine that is to quantify the attributes that papers were marketed by, and by doing it in a repeatable way. And this is really complicated, as you'll see. So to quote a photo miniature article on available papers for the year 1910, quote, platinum papers are roughly divided into 2 categories, black and sepia. Different varieties are described by trade names according to their different weights, thicknesses, and surface textures, and other characteristics of the paper stock. The Platino type company offers 15 varieties. Eastman Kodak includes 11, Ilford only 2, and Gavert offers 11, including papers coated on Japanese paper. So this means for 1910, there are 39 different papers available from these 4 manufacturers alone. So luckily for me, the photographers tend to be creatures of habit, and they tend to stick with papers that they like. So within the hundreds of possibilities that Day could have been using, what I'm trying to find out is what are the 5 to 20 that he was using. One of the ways papers were marketed was by paper weight or thickness. And here you see a 1908 catalog for a platinum paper manufacturer, Willis and Clements. And you can see they offer 3 weights. It seems easy to track if you're just looking at 3 weights, but remember it's just one manufacturer and 1 year. Thicknesses of papers could vary from manufacturer to manufacturer and could change from year to year or even within paper lots. So paper thickness was measured using an analytical paper micrometer. 5 readings of each print were taken, and then a standard deviation and average were calculated. The micrometer measures the paper down to 1/100th of a millimeter, giving a very accurate reading. Current methods for describing paper thickness in catalogs use arbitrary or subjective terms such as thin, very thin, thick. These methods can be helpful for a gross overview of paper thickness, but when you can assign a value to the paper, then comparisons between papers becomes precise, repeatable, and allows for comparison between multiple examiners. So paper thickness didn't show that much information when we look at it across the entire collection, and that's what you see at the top of this graph. But on the bottom, you see it broken out according to the peach kind of area is paper thickness in platinum papers. And you can see it starts to get broken up further. And then below that is paper thickness for cyanotype papers. And so why is this helpful? Like, why does this matter? Because if a day photograph comes to you and it's a day image and it's on a cyanotype, but it has a thickness of 0.3 millimeters, then you could start to ask, well, maybe that's not a day photograph, or it wasn't printed by him. And you would ask for further scrutiny on that. Texture has always been an important attribute of photographic papers, and platinum papers are no exception. And some textures were appropriate for specific processing techniques, but mostly the choice was personal, dependent on the vision that the artist had for the print. And so again, here we see the catalog, and they're offering 3 textures. If we can't understand and compare paper texture, we're at a huge disadvantage when discussing works of art on paper, including photographs. But the problem is, as of yet, there's no established method for doing this. So in an attempt to quantify and compare the textures found in the Day collection, I tried a newly introduced technique in the field of conservation. So paper texture was examined and recorded using the texture scope, a microphotographic system developed by Paul Messier. The texture scope consists of a precisely fixed light source at a 25-degree angle under magnification, allowing one to examine and photograph the paper texture in a very reliable and repeatable way. Mr. Messier originally designed this for use on silver gelatin prints. So here's Matt Clark, a conservation scientist from the National Gallery, reworking the setup with me to more accurately record the subtle surface textures of plain paper prints such as platinum. And here you can kind of see the texture scope and its schematic. So for this project, I only analyzed the platinum papers in the collection, as the collection was just too big to do everything, and it was the predominant process that Day used in his career, so I tried to narrow it down. So each print was photographed in 2 directions, resulting in 866 images for analysis. And here's a screenshot of the images that were taken. And you can start to see that the textures are similar and some are different, but it's not straightforward. So though these images allow us to document the surface texture of a print, the number and diversity of papers used prohibits efficient and objective visual classification. So you can imagine trying to lay out on a table, like you print these out and you lay out 433 matched pairs and you try to put them in groups just visually, it's like impossible. Your brain would explode. So the idea is that we could develop a way to utilize image processing techniques to automate feature extraction, resulting in a program that would detect strong affinities between textures and organize them into groups for you. Computers. In order to do this, the color data is first removed. The image is made square, so the pixels on each side are the same, and an edge detection analysis is run, resulting in images where the texture is more defined and easier to see. So you can kind of see that here. And then following this, the images were submitted for a collaborative competition amongst 4 university teams specializing in signal processing. Each team tried varying methods, and you can read them up here. I don't know much about math, so have at it. They tried different methods to sort the texture into light groups, and you can see the teams and their methods here. And it was a blind test, so they only had the images, but they didn't know how they should come out. And my job in all of it was to figure out how they returned the data in groups, did it make sense art historically with what we know about the collection? And so results were returned to me in 3 ways, one of which was in the form of affinity maps, which is one of these that you see here. And this was by Andy Klein from WPI. And so what you see here are the sums of the H and V, so the 2 images were horizontal and vertical, and they're summed. And the value was turned into grayscale and then plotted. And so what you see is the darkest areas are papers with the most affinity, and the lightest areas are papers with least affinity. And in the light areas, when you see a little darkness, that's an outlier. So it's a paper that doesn't fall into a group. Thus far, results show that the analysis is too sensitive. resulting in core groups but with many outliers. So work needs to be done to refine the technique, making it less sensitive to minor differences in paper and image capture. But I hold high hopes for this technique. I really hope it will work because it would be really amazing to people that study works of art on paper. And it's been proven to work on more isotropic papers, such as silver gelatin papers. But I think for anisotropic papers like platinum papers, more collaboration is needed to kind of give us more of a real-world sense of texture observation. Okay, returning to the marketing of paper, platinum papers were marketed to consumers using two color-based attributes, the color of the image material and the color of the base paper. And image was marketed in black or sepia, implying the addition of mercury, and paper base was generally marketed as white or buff. So the point is that color is important to document. And so I wanted to document the color of the prints and the image material and the base paper. And so I used what we call a colorimeter, and it's a device that provides a reading of an object's color in a repeatable and quantitative way. And so the essence is that these colorimetric values, once made into data points, can be used to track change in the object over time, but also can be input into various programs to run color comparisons. So over 6,000 color readings were taken on the collection. And here's just one graph that you can see, one way that I can look at what does this mean. So I displayed the color data through this program. It's called ImageJ. It's an open, public domain Java-based image processing program that was developed by the National Institute of Health. And in this graph, we're just seeing the median blue value on the Y and the median red value on the X-axis. And it's just one way that we can look at it, but what we see in this graph is that different processes start to fall out into different color fields. And so if you're wanting to group things together, maybe for analysis, and you want to know what's a quick and dirty way to look at all of the silver gelatin printed out prints, you could use this as a way to look at the collection as a whole. And I think that there will be a lot more uses for this type of data, but I think I need more data from other aspects of this project to come through, and then the color data will be more meaningful. And the final technique I used in the study was X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. And this technique uses X-rays to identify the elemental composition of materials. And the information regarding the elements present, combined with an in-depth knowledge of photographic process chemistry, can allow for accurate process identification. So here's a print and its associated spectrum. And the marked peaks identify silver, gold, barium, lead, and strontium. And from this information, we can determine that this print is a gold-toned silver gelatin print. Processes were confirmed using XRF because visual identification is not always reliable, and because within processes there are many variations that can change the final appearance of the image. For instance, these prints I recently made in a workshop are all platinum prints, but vary greatly due to their processing. Manufacturer-marketed sepia papers imply mercury in the sensitizer, but it, as well as other additives, can be applied in the sensitization or developing steps. And these small variations in elemental composition are one of the most important in helping to identify an artist's working methods. And you can see many examples of this in the Day collection, but here's one. These are 2 platinum prints from the collection, but they look really different. And so XRF was run on them to determine what was causing this significant color difference. And the more neutral one is just a straight platinum print, while the orange one has almost the same amount of platinum as the neutral one, but it also includes barium sulfate and also strontium. And I actually have no idea what this means. I've never read about barium or strontium being used in platinum papers, so I really want to pursue this in the future to figure out if this is something just very particular today or if it was used by a particular manufacturer. But there's like a whole line of questioning that goes with this slide. So this talk presented you with an overview of the rationale behind the data collection, the methods employed and some of the observations associated with the particular methods used. And there's so much to say and not enough time, and I'm sure you're all tired from listening to so many things. But a lot was done during this year, that's the point. And more needs to be done in analyzing the data to determine what emerges from the data that's already been gathered. And then, in addition, more needs to be done to acquire more data to give a better in-depth picture of Day's working methods. Most importantly, XRF should be continued to give specifics about trace components in papers and toning procedures throughout time. Future work on the paper texture data is currently underway and will be explored in an upcoming meeting of the teams in November of this year. I also think that analysis of paper fiber content and sizing would be very important. And if you found this work so interesting and you just have to have more, there's an upcoming symposium at the National Gallery of Art, and it's all on platinum printing and platinum papers, so save the date. And I'll be talking about Day there too. So in closing, I just want to say that this year was an amazing experience for me. I was able to explore cutting-edge techniques in the field, applying new technologies to the study of photographs. I was able to look all over the library. I went to prints and photographs, manuscripts, rare book, the general collections, just reading and looking at things. I spent a year working on one photographer. For a conservator in an institution of 12 million photographs, I can't tell you how unusual that is. And I worked with institutions as close as the National Gallery of Art to as far away as the Netherlands on redefining the way we look at photographic papers. I'm leaving you with these two negatives that I found in the Massachusetts Historical Society. They're, from what I know, the only remaining 6 F. Holland Day negatives, and they were attributed to another artist in their collection. I embarked on this journey of discovery hoping that a materials-based approach to photography would change how we interpret a photographer's work. And while a year is just not enough to explore this, I believe that we can start to see that it can. Transforming our qualitative observations into quantitative data will now let us examine all of the aspects of this artist's work in a multitude of ways that were not possible before. And as a conservator, I firmly believe that this is the future direction of our field. We are not just able to advise on the preservation and care of materials, but instead conservators, through continued collaboration with both those in and outside of the arts, can use our knowledge of materials to offer a unique perspective on the study of material culture. And thank you so much to so many people that helped me with this project, but especially Paul Messier, Verna Curtis, and Andrew Robb, and Connie McCabe, without whose support this work would never have been possible. And thank you so much to the staff in the Office of Scholarly Programs and to John W. Kluge, whose thoughtful bequest established this center and the Staff Fellowship at the Library of Congress. And thanks to all the math guys. That's it. Are there any questions? Or are you all just like completely confused? Yeah, Jeannie.
So I'm just wondering, you looked at just one photographer. Do you see a whole lot of future then in doing comparisons over time with different photographers who would then be using different, so maybe relate their paper, but different methods, and so the image comes out differently, even though you've got the same base?
Yeah, I mean, this project was really a way to establish a methodology for doing this. Like, how do we do this, and what information is the most important to gather, so that other people, we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So a lot of the future work will be to figure out what I think was the most important, why, how to track it, what I would improve. But then the goal would be that that other people would take this model and they would use the same types of methods. And then all that work can be compiled. And so many people are working on platinum papers at the time, and there's only so many manufacturers. So what I do with Day will have implications for someone who studies Stieglitz or Steichen. And so it all overlaps. I mean, they all knew each other and work together, and so it doesn't really just apply to him. This was just a very good starting point because the collection is so complete, and it spans his entire career, and the provenance is amazing. So, and it's all here. I mean, a lot of times when you're studying Stieglitz or something, you can have 5 prints here and 20 here and 40 here, and so you have to travel all over. And I could do this all right here. So, yay, Library of Congress. Are there any other questions? Oh.
Adrienne, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Quick question. I know it's great to do it all here, but had you reached out to any institutions? Since you was in England for a while. Do they have some collections there? Or?
He was very good friends with Frederick Evans, who was another platinum artist, and they exchanged prints throughout their lives. So a large portfolio of prints was held by the Royal Photographic Society, and now that's in Bradford. But I think it's about 40 items. So compared to our 690, it's a very small amount, which is one of the reasons that, I mean, I was obsessed with Day before this project, and now you can only imagine. But one of the reasons I picked him for this was that I didn't have to go anywhere. It really just utilized what we had here. But I would love to add as much as I can, like from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the National Gallery has some work. So yeah, hopefully. Anyone else? Yeah, it was, well, Connie, would you like, Connie's organizing that symposium, so. Oh.
Hi, the question was about the symposium that's coming up in 2014, October 21st through the 24th. And actually, because the National Gallery of Art's East Building is undergoing renovation at the time, we got booted. Fortunately, our colleagues at the National Museum of the American Indian have offered graciously to host the program. And it'll also be, there will be tours at the Library of Congress, Museum of American History, and the National Gallery, and other little events going on at the same time, and a workshop which will be demonstration-based, that'll be taught by Mike Ware and scientist Chris Manus, and that'll be held at the National Gallery. So, mark your calendar.
Yes.
October 2014.
Anyone else?
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, but I actually wanted to know about the colleagues you're working with in other institutions to do like the spectrometry and all. Are they working specifically on photographs, or do they work in a wide variety of media?
All of the XRF analysis, the X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, was done here in our institution, and it was Fenella who asked the question. She's the chief of that division, and I did it with Lynn Brostoff and some of our interns here. So that was I was able to do that in-house. The external math people, the teams that are working on that, those teams were working on site, but they didn't need the photographs. They just needed the data, so that was very convenient. I could just send them things digitally. We are working on, the National Gallery of Art is doing a lot on platinum printing right now, so we've been talking a lot, which has been a huge help. So we've been sharing in that way. So did that answer your question? All right. Well, I think that's it. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.